Section 30 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Proceedings of the International Geographic Conference in Chicago, July 27 through 28, 1893. Memoirs and Addresses. Early Voyages along the Northwestern Coast of America, by Professor George Davidson, Ph.D., SCD, etc., President of the Geographical Society of the Pacific. Part 1. Preliminary Remarks. The geodetic work of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey was extended to the Pacific seaboard in 1850, at a time when the geography of the coast was very imperfectly known, and when the names of capes, bays, rivers, and islands were in much confusion. Part of my duty in the initiation of this public work consisted in the determination of the latitude and longitude of the headlands, islands, harbors, rivers, rocks, and dangers, and in the geographic reconnaissance of the coastline from the Mexican boundary to the 49th parallel. While in command of the surveying brig Fauntleroy, I entered upon the self-imposed task of writing a coast pilot for California, Oregon, and Washington. Very naturally, my early interest in the old explorations became intensified as I sought to give the authority for each discovery and for each name, and I made many special examinations of the narratives that were then available for the identification of doubtful localities. This work continued with more or less directness until I was gathering the material for rewriting the 4th edition of the Coast Pilot, and when I had familiarized myself with every mile of our own coast and had a fair acquaintance with the ocean coast of Lower California as far as San Jose del Cabo. Along the whole seaboard I had sketched the landfall, the headlands, and the notable features of the coast to be able to recall their peculiarities. Collation of the old narratives. In order to preserve some of the results of these investigations, incidental to my official duties, I determined to collate the narratives of Ulloa, 1539, Cabrillo and Ferrelo, 1542-43, Drake, 1579, and Vizcaino, 1602-03, and later authorities. And in the extended record thereof, I am satisfied that most, if not every one of the discrepancies of the old Spanish and English navigators have been reconciled. The inaccuracies of the earliest discoverers arose principally from errors of their crude instruments, ignorance of the coast currents, errors of judgment in estimating distances, unreliable compasses, etc. Among the Spanish discoverers, the meagerness of detailed descriptions, a failure to seize the salient points for determining their positions, the want of minute accuracy in most of their plans, sometimes giving importance to general features and sometimes to details without distinction, and a human weakness to exaggerate certain discoveries and yet to overlook completely others as or more important, have much involved the locating of many of their landfalls, headlands, bays, and anchorages. Even with the accuracy of Vizcaino, personal acquaintance with parts of the coast is absolutely necessary to establish identification. The earlier navigators had not the education to carry through extensive and orderly narratives, and we can easily imagine that the priest who invariably accompanied these expeditions was the principal author of the reports. Moreover, the effects of the ever-present scurvy harassed the commander and lowered the whole nervous tone of the strongest men and the wretched Indians. Vizcaino returned with half his crew, and but 2 or 3 men able to do ordinary duty. The broken records of Drake's 2 anchorages on our Pacific coast are very meager and unsatisfactory until carefully weighed and elucidated by personal knowledge and the assembling of nearly contemporary material. The minuteness of record in the full and faithful narratives of Cook and Vancouver, of comparatively recent date, has enabled me to follow their track day by day and to correct their positions by personal knowledge of the localities which they describe. But while giving these great discoverers the fullest credit for surveys unparalleled before or since their time, when all the attendant circumstances are considered, I cannot withhold my admiration for the indomitable courage and perseverance of the older Spanish navigators who, in ill-conditioned and ill-supplied vessels, with crude instruments and methods, and with crews nearly destroyed by scurvy, fought their way from the tropics to the wildest parts of the Alaskan coast regardless of seasons. There were giants in the earth in those days. The records of such of these earlier voyages as have been published are too short and meager to be of much more value than isolated statements of what was done on given dates, and the inaccuracy of the observations for the determination of the geographic positions has led many writers to judge that all these men were touched with the spirit of Maldonado, da Fonte, and de Fuca. In comparatively recent controversy, which was unfortunately marred by national feelings, Cabrillo and Ferrelo have been placed not only at the latitudes which their erroneous instruments presumably gave, but located on the immediate coast, when they were storm-driven far to seaward, while Drake has, even at this late day, been carried as far north as the island of Vancouver. But with the present knowledge of our coast, it is possible to locate Ulloa in his heroic struggle north of the Gulf of Sebastian Vizcaino, to track Cabrillo and Ferrelo in their discoveries in the terrific southeasters of our midwinter, to place Drake under Cape Ferrelo and Punta de los Reyes, and to fix with certainty the most of Vizcaino's positions. Later than 1603 I have not undertaken identifications in this short paper, except to incidentally mention Father Terrival's visit to Port Eugenio and his landing upon Natividad and Cerros Islands, which has been so much misapprehended by our recent author. The Voyages of Cabrillo and Ferrelo, 1542–43. I was particularly interested in the voyages of Cabrillo and Ferrelo, and in studying their narratives have endeavored to put myself in their places. Understanding the character of the seasons and the difficulties of the winds, currents, swells, and fogs which they encountered, I have tried to follow them day by day in their exciting discoveries. The two narratives had to be collated and studied as a general statement. Then every word and idiomatic phrase had to be carefully weighed and defined. The mistranslation of certain words in Cabrillo, Ferrelo, and Vizcaino had misled previous investigators. I based my translation of the narrative of Cabrillo upon the condensed, unconnected, and unsatisfying chapters of Herrera, corrected several mistakes, and deciphered one or two obscure passages. Ferrelo's narrative is in moderate detail, and presents several critical passages where important issues are involved, yet I feel satisfied that every case of doubt has been elucidated. These two narratives are of unequal value. The original of Cabrillo has certainly been lost, and as he died during the exploration, the statements after the first 10 days are extremely meager. Discoveries like that of San Diego Bay are not mentioned. Once there is a difference of date with Ferrelo, and occasionally particular expressions are common to both narratives. For Drake's share of discovery on this coast, we have The World Encompassed, printed by the Hakluyt Society, the Arcano del Mare of Dudley, the English Hero, and later productions. For the narrative of Vizcaino, I have used the Noticia de la California, etc., by the Father Miguel Venegas, of which the published English translation is unsatisfactory. So far as I have learned, there are no charts of Ulloa, Cabrillo, and Ferrelo extant. Learning that there was a manuscript chart in the Royal Museum of Munchen exhibiting the line of coast as seen by Drake between latitudes 42.5° and 38°, I obtained full-size photographs of this invaluable record, which was evidently the basis for Dudley's chart of that part of the coast in his Arcano del Mare of 1647. Except the orientation of Drake's chart, the shoreline from Rogue River in 42.5° to Drake's Bay, under 38°, is remarkably consistent with the general outline of the coast as laid down by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey. From the British Museum I obtained tracings of the Portus Novi Albionis of Drake, and part of the hemisphere whereon is shown his northwesternmost position and the Crescent City Reef, the Dragon Rocks of Vancouver, never before connected with his landfall of the coast. To trace Vizcaino's narrative, I first followed his chart of California as given by Burney, but have since obtained from the State Department at Washington copies of the coastline, as drawn from his 32 plans, by the navigators of the Sutil and Mexicano, 1802, with all his names. This chart is of variable scale and without parallels of latitude, but when these are supplied through means of well-recognized capes and harbors, it is a remarkably good work for that period. The modern charts which have been consulted have all been made by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, and the coast pilots from San Jose del Cabo northward have been consulted for exactness of geographic position and for the views of headlands. The errors of their instruments. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that there were large errors in the determinations of the latitude by Cabrillo and Ferrelo. These and the erroneous estimates of distances were at first very confusing for the identification of capes and harbors insufficiently described, and I had to rely upon my personal knowledge of the coast and seaboard to locate them. The navigators rarely gave the latitude nearer than half a degree, but the effect of this was not apparent at the outset, where their reported measures were very nearly in accord with the true positions. When I had established the large and constantly increasing errors as the vessels sailed northward, the identification was much simplified. There were several points on the coast of Mexico, and one or more near the southern extremity of Lower California, whose latitudes were doubtless known to all the navigators with a reasonable degree of accuracy, and evidently accepted by Cabrillo and Ferrelo. The latitude of Puerto de Navidad, whence the San Salvador and La Victoria sailed, is 19 degrees 13 minutes north, and quite naturally it is not mentioned by either of the captains. Cape Corrientes, which is well known, is distant 30 leagues from Navidad, in latitude 20 degrees 25 minutes, and although Ferrelo says that they had a southeast wind and estimated the distance at 40 leagues, Cabrillo places the cape in latitude 20 degrees and a half. At this time I assume he did not observe for the latitude, but adopted that given by previous authorities. After crossing the Gulf of California, Cabrillo says, on Sunday, the 2nd of July, they found themselves in 24 degrees and more, and recognized the Puerto del Marqués del Valle, which they called La Cruz, which is the coast of California. Ferrelo says they anchored the following Monday on the 3rd of the same month, off the point of California, etc. The easternmost land of the peninsula of Lower California is Cape Pulmo, under which there is a good anchorage and fresh water. The eastern point of the land, which is a cliff 410 feet high and rises rapidly inland, is in latitude 23 degrees 23 minutes, and if Cabrillo observed for latitude, as we may feel assured he did when he made this landfall, the correction to his determination is 0 degrees 37 minutes and more. At Cape San Lucas, the southwesternmost point of the peninsula, the ships anchored in the comfortable bay and took in water. The anchorage is in latitude 22 degrees 52 minutes, and its position was already known. Cabrillo does not mention this harbor, and Ferrelo evidently did not observe for latitude, for his narrative states, they say that this port is in 23 degrees. This indicates a correction of 0 degrees, 0.08 minutes to the assumed position. From Cape San Lucas the navigators followed the coast, which Ulloa had discovered 3 years earlier. If they had copies of his chart or of his report, they never refer to them or to him, or use his names of capes and bays, except the island of Cedros. Northward of Cape San Lucas we begin to find the large errors of latitude which began at the point of California. As they were reconnoitering the coast during the summer months, the weather was generally fair for observation, the winds adverse and sometimes quite strong, the swell heavy, and the fogs increasing as they advanced. Until well to the northward the fogs would rarely prevent a noon observation for latitude. The two narratives refer to 71 positions that are subject to identification, yet it is somewhat singular that the Cabrillo narrative has only 2 independent observations for latitude, while the Ferrelo narrative has 22. Whenever the latitude of a place is given by both narratives, which occurs 8 times, the 2 statements are identical, except in the case of Point Conception, where the correction to Cabrillo's determination is 2 degrees 3 minutes, and to Ferrelo's 1 degree 33 minutes and more. The corrections, with a gradual increase as the latitude increases, are fairly uniform for certain stretches, when we consider that the latitude was rarely stated closer than half a degree, except to add that it was more on 4 occasions and scant on another. From latitude 23 degrees 23 minutes to 28 degrees 6 minutes, the average correction to 11 determinations is 0 degrees 48 minutes, with a range from 37 minutes to 58 minutes. From latitude 28 degrees 55 minutes to 31 degrees 45 minutes, the average correction to 9 determinations is 1 degree 4 minutes, with a range from 42 minutes to 75 minutes. From latitude 31 degrees 51 minutes to 34 degrees 27 minutes, the average correction to 9 determinations is 1 degree 24 minutes, with a range from 60 minutes to 123 minutes. This line of coast includes San Diego, San Buenaventura, and Point Conception. From latitude 36 degrees 3 minutes to 38 degrees 31 minutes, the average correction to 8 determinations is 1 degree 18 minutes, with a range from 79 minutes to 91 minutes, including the determination in the Gulf of the Farallones and of the landfall of Cato Mountain, which are not closely located. It is somewhat remarkable that the position of San Diego Bay and of Point Conception, which latter was to them a notable cape, should present larger errors of the instruments than any other places on the coast. At San Diego, the correction to Ferrelo's determination is 1 degree 40 minutes, and at Point Conception 1 degree 33 minutes and more to Ferrelo, and 2 degrees 3 minutes to Cabrillo. In these extreme and infrequent cases, I suspect erroneous readings of the instruments, amounting to not less than 30 minutes of arc, or of the whole diameter of the sun. These corrections must govern the high latitudes which the navigators report to have reached when they were struggling for life in the great storms far from land, and almost up to the latitude reached by Drake less than 37 years later. Erroneous estimates of distances. The estimates of distances along the exposed seaboard when the vessels were buffeted by the regular northwesters and the large swell and offshore adverse current are, as a rule, so irregular and erroneous that they are almost useless for determining intermediate positions. When they reached the quieter waters of the Santa Barbara Channel, with little wind, before the rainy season, with very small swell and little current, it was possible to proportion the erroneous estimate of distance between San Buenaventura and Point Conception, and with a personal knowledge of localities, I was able to fix every anchorage they made under that pleasant and populous coast, and where they held frequent intercourse with the friendly Indians. End of section 30. Section 31 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Proceedings of the International Geographic Conference in Chicago, July 27 through 28, 1893. Memoirs and Addresses. Early Voyages along the Northwestern Coast of America, by Professor George Davidson, Ph.D., SCD, etc., President of the Geographical Society of the Pacific. Part 2. The main features of the discoveries of Cabrillo and Ferrelo. The general progress of the two ships may be first briefly stated by mentioning the more easily identified places, and then by following their narratives in more or less detail. The vessels sailed in company from Cape San Lucas in latitude 22 degrees 52 minutes, July 6, 1542. Reached Magdalena Bay in latitude 24 degrees 32 minutes, July 13. Pequeña Bay and Point in latitude 26 degrees 14 minutes, July 19. Port San Bartolome in latitude 27 degrees 39 minutes, August 1. Cerros Island in latitude 28 degrees 2 minutes, August 5. Point Canoas in latitude 29 degrees 25 minutes, August 15. Port San Quentin in latitude 30 degrees 24 minutes, where they took possession of the country, August 21. Point Santo Tomas in latitude 31 degrees 33 minutes, September 8. San Diego Bay in latitude 32 degrees 40 minutes, September 28. Santa Catalina Island in latitude 33 degrees 27 minutes, October 7, and San Buenaventura at the eastern entrance to the Santa Barbara Channel in latitude 34 degrees 17 minutes, October 10. During these 3 months their progress had been very slow, because the prevailing summer wind was directly ahead, and they must have made many and many a tack to work their clumsy vessels to windward. With the modern vessel of the same size the time would have been less than a month. The weather was favorable, no storms of wind and rain, but generally clear skies, with fogs at night, but absent by day. They reached the Santa Barbara Channel in the pleasantest part of the year, after the long dry season, and the country apparently much parched. They had no difficulties with the natives, and we may well suppose that they looked forward with hope and confidence to continued success and the prospect of the discovery of precious metals. At San Buenaventura they established very friendly relations with the populous villages of that vicinity, with the river coming through the mountains on the west, and the Santa Clara coming through the broad, flat valley to the eastward. They readily obtained food from the natives, and perhaps had no need to draw the seine. In their progress through the Santa Barbara Channel, they must have been charmed by its beauty and by the friendliness of the natives, for they anchored half a dozen times. Cabrillo says, "They sailed little in several days on account of the too fine weather, and on Wednesday, the 18th of said month, October, they arrived at a long point which forms a cape, and on account of its length, like a galley, they named it El Cabo de la Galera." This is the Point Conception of our charts. The weather of the Santa Barbara Channel at that season of the year is extremely lovely. When at Point Conception for 3½ months, in 1850, I have seen sailing vessels 5 or 6 days, in irons, drifting slowly from Santa Barbara to Point Conception, with the weak current to the westward, while outside the Cape a steady 10-knot breeze from the northwest was blowing for weeks. A vessel bound to the northwestward and opening from under the lee of the Cape would frequently be reduced to short canvas in an hour. At that season of the year, the southeast storms which bring up the rain are due, and Cabrillo and Ferrelo soon experienced them. Through this channel passage I have been able to locate every anchorage which the vessels made, and have disentangled the parallel range of the Santa Barbara Islands, which from certain points of view overlap each other. Even the confusion of double names which they used has been made clear. From Point Conception the strong northwest winds forced the vessels down upon the westernmost of the Santa Barbara Islands, 23 miles southward from Point Conception, where they were compelled to remain in Port Possession, Cuyler's Harbor, 8 days, because a southeaster had sprung up with rain and the weather was very stormy. Here Cabrillo formally took possession of the country. After leaving this island on the 25th of October for the mainland, they met with very severe weather north of Point Conception, and struggled heroically until the 1st of November, when they could not carry a palm of sail, and sought shelter under that cape at the anchorage of the Coxo Viejo, where there was a large village called Zexo. Wood was scarce at this place, and the vessels changed their anchorage to that off the Gaviota Pass, about 10 miles to the eastward, where the Indians had 2 villages, and there was an abundance of wood, water, and fish. It is an open roadstead, protected in part by large fields of kelp. The intercourse of the Indians and the navigators was evidently very satisfactory to both parties, and the vessels remained at anchor until the 6th of November, when they left for the Cape with very light airs, which gave them no steerage way, for they were 4 days making 12 or 13 miles. Off the Cape another southeaster came up, and the vessels ran before it, making good progress, and sufficiently close to the land to assure themselves that there was no southeast anchorage. On the 11th of November the vessels were under the shadow of the compact, bold, and precipitous mountain barrier of the Sierra Santa Lucia, which rises in latitude 35 degrees 54 minutes to an elevation of over 5,000 feet, at a distance of not quite 3 miles inland. Here the southeaster broke upon the vessels in all its fury. And at 4 o'clock in the night, being in the sea about 6 leagues from the coast, lying to, waiting for daybreak, so great a storm struck them from the southwest and the south-southwest, with rain and dark cloudy weather, that they could not keep up a handbreadth of sail, and it made them scud with a small foresail with much labour all the night, and a great sea that nearly engulfed them, and at dawn, the wind blowing tremendously, it was not possible to run before the wind, and on account of the strong sea, wind, and dense clouds, one vessel lost sight of the other, and that one vessel threw overboard everything that could lighten her from the deck, because the storm was very great, and on the Capitana, seeing themselves in the greatest danger, they vowed a pilgrimage to Our Lady of the Rosary, and the Blessed Mother of Pity for her mercy, and she favored them with a little fair weather. Cabrillo Ferrelo. Ferrelo continues, that on Monday, the 13th of the said month of November, at the hour of vespers, the weather cleared up, and the wind veered to the west, and immediately they made sail and went in search of their consort, steering toward the land, praying to God that they might discover her, as they much feared that she would be lost. They were running to the north and to the north-northwest, with the wind west and west-northwest, and the following Tuesday at daybreak they had sight of the land, and they were able to hold on until the evening, and they could see that the land was very high. And they cruised along the coast to discover if there was any port where they might take shelter. And so great was the swell of the sea that it was fearful to behold, and the coast was bold, and the mountains very lofty, and at evening they lay to for rest. It is a coast running northwest to southeast. They perceive the land at a point where it projects into the ocean, which forms a cape, and the point is covered with trees, and it is in 40 degrees. He afterwards adds that these grand sierras were covered with snow and many trees. I have given this long extract because this landfall is the farthest land they reached in this first attempt to trace the coast northward. In his description he does not refer to any jutting point of cliffs on the immediate shoreline. It is the bold, high, transverse, wooded spur of the coast mountains, nearly overhanging Fort Ross Cove, in latitude 38 degrees 31 minutes, and gives a correction to Cabrillo and Ferrelo's determination of 1 degree 29 minutes. Cabrillo says they called it Cabo de Pinos, and observing the sun, they found themselves in 40 degrees and more to the northwest, from whence they recognized more than 15 leagues of coast, all the land high, and the coast running from northwest to southeast. The vessels were evidently not near enough to this rocky, dark, and forbidding coast in winter storms to see the details of the high, jagged cliffs forming the shoreline, which is fringed with outstanding rocks and hidden dangers marked by breakers. This bold shoulder, covered with the great forests of fir, was subsequently the distinguishing mark for the Russian otter-hunting ships when seeking the small northwest anchorage of Fort Ross Cove. The massive character of the orography is well exhibited in the latest edition of the chart of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey. On the 15th of November, the two ships had sight of each other, and their experience through the last storm compelled them to return to the southward. On the 16th, at daybreak, they were arrived at a great gulf that looked like a harbor, and which was formed by a change of the direction of the shore, which appeared to have a port and a river. And they went beating about this day and the night, and the Friday following, until they saw that there was no river, nor any shelter, and to take possession they cast anchor in 45 fathoms. They did not dare to land on account of the high sea. This gulf is in 39 degrees and more, and it is all covered with pines to the sea. They gave it the name of La Bahia de los Pinos. The following night they lay to until daybreak. Ferrelo. The change of direction of the shore here mentioned is the projection of the great head of Point Reyes more than 12 miles outside the general trend of the coast, and the great gulf under it is the present Gulf of the Farallones, which is understood to embrace the area between Point Reyes, the groups of the Farallones, and Point San Pedro, including the Golden Gate to San Francisco Bay, and the anchorage of Drake's Bay under the eastern extremity of Point Reyes Head. It is very interesting to note what Ferrelo states about this gulf, because it was evident to his nautical eye that the discolored water therein indicated the presence of a great river. As they were near enough the land to be satisfied that no landing could be made on account of the large swell, and as they lay particular stress upon the forests, I judged they were beating in the northern part of this gulf to secure an anchorage under the north shore, but failed. These discolored waters were brought down by freshets from the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. They are known to all our vessels, and are particularly marked after great storms. From the summit of Point Reyes I have watched them carried by the littoral drift, or the Davidson inshore eddy current, far to the northward of Point Reyes, and they extend well outside of the Farallones. With more favorable conditions of weather, such persistent efforts for exploration would have rewarded these men with the discovery of Drake's Bay and doubtless the Golden Gate. When they had decided that further search was useless, they anchored and took possession of the country through the slender hold of their cable. With the depth of 45 fathoms, the vessels must have been either 6 or 7 miles from the southeast Farallone, outside the line thence to Point Reyes, or more likely 5 miles southeastward from the southeast Farallone, and in about latitude 37 degrees 40 minutes. Inside of these depths the plateau of the Gulf decreases very gradually and regularly in depth toward the shores and toward the bar of the Golden Gate. In the position southward from the island, the correction to Ferrelo's latitude is about 1 degree 30 minutes. It is a rather curious fact that neither narrative refers to the two groups of the Farallones, close to which they must have anchored. The northwest group comprises 4 principal islets within an area of 1 mile by 1/4 of a mile, and exhibits 5 or 6 high rocky peaks, of which the highest is 155 feet. The southeast Farallone has an area of about 1 mile by 3/4 of a mile, is very irregular in outline, and broken into 4 or 5 bold granitic peaks, of which the highest is 340 feet above the sea, and is visible from a ship's deck at about 20 miles. Drake, in 1579, anchored under the eastern point of Point Reyes Head, in the northernmost part of the Gulf of the Farallones, and named the two groups of islets. From the southeast Farallone his vessel obtained a large supply of fresh sea lion meat. Vizcaino does not mention the groups of the Farallones in his published narrative, but they are laid down on his plans. The great storm which Cabrillo's vessels had encountered had covered the mountains of the peninsula of San Francisco with snow, and Ferrelo, in describing the coast from the great gulf southward, says, "All the coast they pass by this day is very bold, and there is a great swell of the sea, and the land is very lofty. There are mountains which rise to the sky, and the sea beats upon them. While sailing near the land, it appears as if they would fall upon the ships. They are covered with snow to the summit." They gave them the name of Las Sierras Nevadas, and the principal one forms a cape which projects into the sea, which they named El Cabo de Nieve. The coast runs north-northwest and south-southeast. It does not appear that Indians inhabit this coast. This Cabo de Nieve is in 30 and 8 degrees and 2/3, and always, when the wind blew from the northwest, it made the weather fair and clear. Cabrillo says they were seeking for a port, and hence the minuteness of the foregoing narration. This snowy cape and the erroneous latitude 38 degrees 40 minutes has given rise to much speculation as to its identification. The description of the navigators, although somewhat exaggerated, is sufficiently good to satisfy one who is acquainted with the characteristics of this high backbone of the peninsula and with the occasional high cliffs, and is quite satisfactory to those who have encountered heavy snowstorms in the coast range of mountains. In some very heavy southeasters, such as that we experienced in the Santa Lucia range early in January 1880, the cold is quite severe, reaching 17 degrees Fahrenheit, the force of the wind terrific, and the depth of the snow 2 or 3 feet. This Cabo de Nieve, or Snowy Cape, is the massive western spur or buttress of the high mountains of this part of the peninsula of San Francisco, and rises abruptly and immediately behind the low, rocky, and dangerous point Año Nuevo. Mount Bache, or Loma Prieta, in the crest line of the mountains, lies nearly east of this cape in latitude 37 degrees 6½ minutes, and reaches an elevation of 3,825 feet, 20 miles from the coastline on the same parallel. A vessel passing 3 or 4 miles outside the shore would rarely notice Point Año Nuevo, except from particular positions, but all vessels following the coast notice the mountain mass projecting beyond the lower hills to the north and south, although it does not break the regularity of the shoreline. This is another of those cases when the vessels laid great stress upon the large features of the coast, and not upon any details of the immediate shore. I'm thoroughly convinced of the identification of this cape. The correction to the determination of the latitude of both ships is 1 degree 31 minutes, where the average of this region is 1 degree 25 minutes. The narratives mention no further details. Even with fair winds, the vessels were not tempted to follow the gradually curving shore to the eastward, where under Point Santa Cruz, in latitude 36 degrees 57 minutes, they would have found anchorage and protection from the northwest swell. Nor did the gulf of the present bay of Monterey allure them. Far to the southward, the mountains of the northern part of the Sierra Santa Lucia were already looming up above the horizon, and on the following Saturday they were running along the coast, and at night they found themselves off El Cabo de San Martin. El Cabo de San Martin is in 37 degrees and a half, which latitude must have been noted from what they observed on their trip to the northward. We may very well conceive that the scurvy was among the crew, and that their provisions were not plentiful. Moreover, Ferrelo's vessel was leaking very badly, and Cabrillo was suffering from his broken arm. They knew that in the port of Possession, on the north side of San Miguel Island, the anchorage in that small bay was protected from the southeast gales. They anchored here on Thursday, the 23rd of November, and because it is a good port, they repaired the small vessel and made her staunch, because she was going to sink. In the aforesaid port they remained until the end of December, on account of the bad weather, with great cold and snow, even to the sea level, rain from heaven, and heavy clouds, and as the southeast storm was continuing, there was so great a surf, although in a landlocked harbor, that sometimes for 3 or 4 days it was not possible to go on shore. On the 3rd of January, 1543, the brave Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo died from the effects of an accident at his first visit in October 1542. He earnestly charged Bartolomé Ferrelo not to give up the voyage of discovery, but to continue his explorations to the northward. Who succeeded Ferrelo to the command of La Victoria is not mentioned, but we may suppose he was the pilot Bartolomé Fernandez. On the 19th of January, 1543, Ferrelo and his consort set sail for the mainland under Point Conception in search of provisions. The vessels were caught by a heavy northwest storm, and for 8 days were driven about among the Santa Barbara Islands, seeking anchorage on account of the foul winds, when they again sought shelter in Port Possession on the 27th of January. They remained here 2 days, when the weather favored them, and they sailed to the island of Santa Rosa to recover the anchors which they had left there when they slipped their cables in a storm. They recovered the anchors and took in a supply of water from Becker's Bay, which is on the northeast face of the island, where they were protected from the southeast storm, which brought much snow. On the 13th of February, they stood across the Santa Barbara Channel to the Gaviota anchorage, which they were forced to leave after getting only 1 boatload of wood. The southeaster brought up a very heavy swell, and they sought shelter under the island of Santa Cruz, because they were there more secure from the storms, and they might be able to make sail and run out to sea. On the 18th of February, the vessels left this island in search of other islands reported to them by the Indians. These islands were doubtless San Nicolas and San Clemente, which had not been seen by them, and at dark they were about 12 leagues from Santa Cruz, and saw 6 islands, some large and others small. At daybreak of the 19th they were about 10 leagues to the windward of the islands, and with the wind west-northwest they were standing off 5 days to the southwest, and after they had proceeded about 100 leagues they found the wind more violent and the sea high, and Thursday, the 22nd of the said month of February, they again stood in shore to endeavour to reach Cabo de Pinos, with the wind south-southeast, which continued 3 days and was increasing each day. This brief search, wherein it is doubtful if they made 100 leagues from the islands, has led Cole to make the unaccountable blunder of supposing that the 6 islands of the Santa Barbara groups which Ferrelo mentioned were doubtless the Sandwich Islands. If we suppose that the course made by Ferrelo was south, halfway between Santa Cruz and San Nicolas, he would probably have seen, in all, the islands of San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, Anacapa, Santa Catalina, with Santa Barbara in line and not distinguishable, and San Nicolas. He could not have seen San Clemente. Anacapa is small but high, and Santa Catalina would at that distance appear small. San Nicolas would have been seen moderately small, because he would make it endwise. When the unusual moderate wind from the northeast changed, and the west-northwest wind came up with a large sea always accompanying it, it is very unlikely that the ships proceeded even 200 miles instead of 100 leagues. Moreover, when Ferrelo changed his course to make his landfall, and the south-southeast wind continued with increasing force, and with a necessarily heavy and broken sea, he must have made by his own account more than 500 miles in less than 3 days under short sail. He got sight of the Cabo de Pinos in latitude 38 degrees 31 minutes at daybreak on the 25th of February. This alone should demonstrate the erroneousness of Cole's supposition. When Ferrelo made the mountains behind Fort Ross at daybreak, he continued his course to the northwestward, and the vessel at dusk was 20 leagues to windward on a coast running northwest and southeast, and it is bold and without shelter. There was no smoke seen on the land, and they saw a point which formed the extremity of the land, which changed the coast to the northwest. In the middle of the night the wind suddenly shifted to the south-southwest, and they run to the west-northwest until day, and in the morning the wind shifted to the west-southwest with great violence, which held on until the following Tuesday, the 27th. They ran to the northwest. This is Ferrelo's narrative, and he gives no latitude. The point which he saw at dark was Point Arena, in latitude 38 degrees 57 minutes, where the shoreline, which has been trending to the northwest, makes a gentle sweep to the northeastward, with low shores and bold wooded mountains behind. The point is the extremity of a plateau 60 feet high, and rises by several steps in 3 miles to 215. It is destitute of timber, but on the higher parts of the plateau the fir trees stretch to the mountains. He doubtless saw the high timbered crestline, rising to 2,300 feet elevation, behind and beyond the point. Cabrillo's narrator does not write a word about the exciting experiences of the vessels from the time they left their anchorage at the Gaviota until the morning after Ferrelo saw Point Arena, when he says, "And Monday, on the 26th of the said month of February, they were at a point which they called Cabo de Fortunas, Cape of Perils, on account of the many dangers which they had experienced in those days, and it is in 41 degrees. If the vessels scudded 20 leagues northwestward from Fort Ross in the short period of daylight, they should have reached latitude 39 degrees 30 minutes. But if Point Arena was what they saw at dark, they could not have been up to Fort Ross at daylight, but had made it out at that time. Granting, however, that they reached the latitude of 39 degrees 30 minutes, and supposing they kept their course, they may next day have seen some distance to the northeast the culminating peak of the coast range of mountains just north of Point Delgada, where King Peak, in latitude 40 degrees 9 minutes, rises to a height of 4,265 feet at 2½ miles from the coastline. This is probably too far north, for Ferrelo says, "Tuesday, the 27th of the said month, the wind veered to the south-southwest, which held on all day. They ran to the west-northwest with the foresails lowered, for it blew violently. At the approach of night the wind shifted to the west. They ran all night to the south, with but little sail. There was a high sea which broke over them. The shore north of Point Arena retreats in a long curve to the eastward to the Ussel River, and then takes the old northwest course. Before reaching so far north as King Peak, one of the great landfalls for this section of the coast, to vessels well offshore, is Cato Mountain, lying north 85 degrees east, magnetic, from Cape Vizcaino. It rises to an elevation of 4,076 feet, and should be visible at a distance of 60 miles from the coast. It is in latitude 39 degrees 41 minutes. Davidson's Coast Pilot. This would give a correction of 1 degree 19 minutes to Cabrillo's position. The vessels were now well out at sea, and Ferrelo says, "The Wednesday following, the 28th day of the said month, at daybreak, the wind shifted directly to the southwest, and it did not blow hard. This day they observed the latitude in 43 degrees. With the average instrumental correction from identified points, this would place the vessels in latitude 41½ degrees, and far out to sea." Ferrelo continues, "Toward night the wind freshened and shifted to the south-southwest. They ran this night to the west-northwest with much difficulty, and Thursday, March 1, at daybreak the wind shifted to the southwest with great fury, and the seas came from many quarters, which harassed them much, and broke over the ships, which not having the decks as in a man of war, if God should not succor them, they could not escape, and not being able to lay to, of necessity they scudded northeast toward the land. And now holding themselves for lost, they commended themselves to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and made their promises or offerings, and ran thus until 3 o'clock in the afternoon with much fear and labor, for they saw they were going to be lost. And already they perceived many signs of the land, which must be near, as small birds and logs, very fresh, which had floated from some rivers, although from the dark and cloudy weather the land did not appear. At this hour the Mother of God succored them with the grace of her Son, and there came a very violent rainstorm from the north, which made them scud all that night and the following day until sunset to the south, with the foresails furled, and because there was a high sea from the south, it broke over them each time at the bow, and swept over them as if over a rock. On the 1st of March, Cabrillo's narrator says, "When the weather cleared up, they observed the sun in 40° 4", with so much cold they were freezing." This observation, corrected by the average instrumental variation, would place the vessel in 42° 30' of latitude, more or less, and well out to sea, because the landfalls in this region can be seen 60 and more miles from seaward. Another important statement is made in relation to the indications of discolored fresh water from rivers. In latitude 42° 25' is the mouth of Rogue River, which discharges an enormous volume of water in the winter storms; Pistol River in 42° 17', Chetka River in 42° 3', and Smith River in 41° 57', besides smaller streams. In the winter freshets these streams bring down great quantities of large trees torn from the banks. How far these signs have been seen seaward we have at present no record. Ferrelo continues his narrative and says, "The wind shifted to the northwest and the north-northwest with great fury, so that it made them run until Saturday the 3rd of March to the southeast and to the east-southeast with such a high sea that it made them cry out without reserve that if God and his blessed Mother did not miraculously save them, they could not escape. Saturday at noon the wind moderated, and remained at the northwest, for which they gave many thanks to our Lord. They suffered also in provisions, as they had only biscuit, and that damaged." And apparently reviewing the last few days' experience, he says, "It appeared to them that there was a very large river, of which they had much indication, between 41° and 40°, for they saw many signs of it." These determinations relate to the coast between latitudes 39° 30' and 41° 30', in which are the following streams: Klamath River in latitude 41° 32', a large stream; Little River under Trinidad Head in 41° 2', Mad River in 40° 56', Humboldt Bay entrance in 40° 45', Eel River, one of the largest rivers in California, in 40° 39', Mattole in 40° 18', Usel, 10 Mile, Noyo, and other streams farther southward. Ferrelo continues, "This day, March 3, in the evening, they recognized the Cabo de Pinos, and on account of the high sea which prevailed, they could do no less than run along the coast on the return course in search of a shelter. They experienced much cold. Monday, on the 5th day of the said month of March, 1543, at dawn, they found themselves off the island of Juan Rodriguez, San Miguel, and they did not dare to enter the port on account of the great storm which prevailed, which broke the sea at the entrance of the harbor in 15 fathoms. The entrance is narrow. They ran under the protection of the Isla de San Salvador on the southeast side. This Puerto de la Isla de San Salvador is Smuggler's Cove on the short southeast side of Santa Cruz Island. The dangers which he reports in 15 fathoms are Wilson Reef, 1 mile in extent, which lies in deep water off the northwest shores of San Miguel Island, 2¼ miles westwardly from the entrance to Cuyler's Harbor or Port Possession. The coast pilot gives particular warning about these dangers. Smuggler's Cove is an open roadstead, with partial protection from heavy northwest weather. Ferrelo, in continuing his narrative, goes back a day or more and says, "And the night before coming with a violent tempest, with only 2 small foresails, the other ship disappeared, so that they suspected that the sea had swallowed it up, and they could not discover it any more, even after daybreak. They believe they must have been in 44 degrees when the last storm overtook them and compelled them to run to leeward. Cabrillo's narrator says that on account of the foregoing storm, they were forced to go to La Isla de la Posesión, San Miguel Island, where they arrived on the 5th, and on account of the heavy breaking at the mouth of the harbor, they sought protection under the Isla de San Sebastián, under the side presented to the south-southeast, and that night of the great tempest the flagship disappeared. After the vessels met at Cerros Island, Ferrelo says, "That ship passed La Isla de Juan Rodriguez at night, passing through some breakers, so that they thought they must be lost, and the mariners promised to go in procession naked to her church, and Our Lady delivered them." This is the first time the Cabrillo narrative has mentioned this island of San Sebastian. As the fragata was off Cuyler's Harbor at night, probably 8 or 10 hours after the Capitana had passed it, with the heavy northwester still blowing, he was very naturally afraid to approach the old anchorage of Port Possession, and probably steered through the San Miguel Passage, and found protection and anchorage under the southeast shore of Santa Rosa Island, between South Point and East Point, which he calls El Puerto de San Sebastian, now known as Johnson's Lee. He must have remained at this anchorage 14 days, while the other vessel lay 3 days in Smuggler's Cove, under Santa Cruz Island, and then searched for her consort at San Buenaventura, again at Smuggler's Cove, at San Diego Bay, Port San Quentin, and finally at the south end of the island of Cerros on the 24th of March, 1543. On the 26th the consort arrived. When she had started to search for the Capitana, the whole crew made their demands that they should return to New Spain, as we had nothing that we could eat, and because this was in reason, they ordered the return, searching for their consort. Cabrillo's narrator. Some question has arisen about the probability of these small, badly equipped vessels, with mixed crews of Spaniards and Indians, broken down by scurvy, making such good time. It seems quite reasonable that they reached the latitude observed, and that they commenced to scud before the northwester from latitude 42 degrees 30 minutes to a position off Fort Ross, making about 275 miles between the morning of March 1 and the evening of March 3, or about 5 miles per hour. From the last position to San Miguel Island, the Capitana sailed not less than 315 miles in about 38 hours, or more than 8 miles per hour, with an evident increase in the force of the wind. Cabrillo's narrator says that in 5 days they ran 200 leagues with reefed foresail, and his vessel reached San Miguel Island on the same day as the San Salvador, but later. It was a run for life, and these masterful navigators must have handled their craft with consummate skill and decision. I have no doubt whatever of their statements. Concluding remarks. This is a condensed review of this heroic voyage or voyages of discovery and exploration in the very heart of our winter gales. The whole story is ingeniously told. There is no complaint of sickness or of the incapacity of the crews. To the seaman, the narrative is full of pathos. I have endeavored to point out only a few of the identifications of the two principal actors. I have not quoted from Ulloa, Drake, or Vizcaíno. To exhibit the details of the narratives of these 5 remarkable men, I drew up, in 1885, their statements in parallel columns, following the localities from the south toward the north, preserving the entire narratives of Cabrillo and Ferrelo, and using such parts of the others as related to the positions of the former, or to new localities intermediate. I then appealed to my personal knowledge of the localities, and to my descriptions from the manuscript for the Coast Pilot of 1889, and to the Coast Pilot of Lower California. During the investigation, doubtful cases of identification were left in abeyance until well-authenticated locations to the north and to the south were fixed, and then the doubtful cases were harmonized without straining. Many minor and interesting statements noted in the narrations have been verified, such as the 17 villages which Ferrelo names from the Gaviota anchorage to Point Conception. On the Coast Survey chart there are 17 arroyos, where we found the remains of old rancherias as we traveled this part of the coast in 1850. It is proper to mention that upon the return of the vessels to the Santa Barbara Islands in March, on their final retreat, the confusion of new names to the islands was added, but fortunately I had learned from my colleagues, who had made the detailed surveys of these islands, the advantages and disadvantages of the anchoring grounds around Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Islands under different conditions of summer blows and winter storms, and I am satisfied that the last anchorages of these navigators have been identified. Of the identification of Drake's anchorages on the coast of California and Oregon, I have not spoken, because I propose to elsewhere present a separate paper upon the former. Nor have I referred specially to the accurate work of Vizcaino, but I may mention that, upon the authority of his narrative, it has been long asserted that a great forest covered the Loma that lies between San Diego Bay and False Bay to the northward. This erroneous statement has arisen from the mistranslation of El Monte, which in the narrative signifies a hill. That is the point Loma of the modern charts. Such instances as these have satisfied me that all the narrators made truthful records, so far as they wrote, and this conviction has enabled me to clearly explain in my monograph several apparent inconsistencies in parts of Vizcaino's narrative. The mass of details presented in the monograph cannot be given in this short paper, but I presented in the report of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey, 1886, Appendix No. 7, a tabulation of the results, which established the identification of the 71 landfalls, capes, points, bays, anchorages, and islands mentioned by Cabrillo and Ferrelo. I also appended a chart to exhibit in graphic and still more condensed form these identifications. It will be noted that in this list and chart there is no mention of the groups of the Farallones off the entrance to San Francisco Bay, although Cabrillo and Ferrelo must have seen them. Drake mentions and names them. Vizcaino has them on his chart, but does not mention them in his narrative. End of section 31. End of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 5.